Hello, everyone. Sorry for that. Thank you all for joining us again for the third talk by the Chosun History Society. We are a public learned society dedicated to the study, research, and teaching of Korea's past. We're brought to you by CISC, which, as some of you know, is the Cambridge Institute for the Study of Korea, and Dr. Mark Byington, who I believe is, yes, he's with us, has kindly given us his support in that. There's also my co-host, Sishan, Six, as some of you may know. And today we're welcoming Dr. Jack Davey, who is going to speak to us today about cultural diversity in Iron Age Korea, the case of Mahan. Dr. Davey is an archaeologist and early Koreanist specializing in the Iron Age of peripheral East Asia and the early states of Proto-Three Kingdoms period Korea. And he has been a part-time faculty member at George Washington University. And since 2020, he's been the managing editor of the Journal of Korean Studies. His current book project is entitled The Ritual Frontiers of Early East Asia. And it examines the relationship between ritual, the natural environment, and culture contact in Iron Age Korea. So with that said, I'm just going to admit a few last people. And I think we're ready to start. So Jack, I'm just going to give you back the pen. And hopefully that's showing for everybody the presentation there.
Showing for me.
Excellent, great. So please take it away.
Great, well, thank you very much for that introduction, Nick. Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about the Southern Korean Iron Age. And I really do think this is one of the most dynamic and interesting areas of Korean archaeology. And it's also the period in which we see the development of the first historical kingdoms on the Southern Peninsula. So Silla, Paekche, and some of the Kaya groups. So I think in that sense, it's also the bedrock upon which much of Korean history is constructed. And for eagle-eyed archaeologists perhaps in the audience, yes, I know those tombs aren't Mahan tombs. They're actually in Daegu, but I think gives you a sense of the kinds of tombs I'm going to be talking about today. Oops, there we go. Yeah, so in terms of chronology, the Iron Age is traditionally divided into two periods, the early Iron Age and the Proto-Three Kingdoms period, spanning roughly from the 4th century BC to the 4th century AD. But the tombs and the archaeology I'm going to talk about today actually begin a bit earlier in the late Mumun, and they extend all the way into what we would consider part of the Three Kingdoms period. So Mahan is an Iron Age entity. It is a product of the Proto-Three Kingdoms period in many ways, but it persists into the Three Kingdoms period too, which makes it this really interesting phenomenon in traditional Korean history, I think. So my research is primarily concerned with the role of mortuary ritual and interaction through the medium of this ritual on the development of the first states or historical kingdoms in this period on the Korean Peninsula. And although I'm looking at a ostensibly historical period and ostensibly a historical phenomenon in Mahan or the Samhan, I'm really approaching it first through the lens of anthropological archaeology. And some of the big questions I think that we can use archaeology to interrogate in this period are, one, the Iron Age really forces us to reconsider the relationship between the peninsula and East Asia as a whole, and in particular China. There are really so many textually invisible flows of interaction that complicate the Sinocentric core periphery framework of interaction that I think is fairly typical of understandings of this period in early East Asia. I also think Iron Age archaeology is a great place to interrogate our ideas of the state, of complex polities, of the idea of social development and the growth of social complexity. In that sense, the Iron Age is really relevant and really important in broader anthropological and archaeological conversations. And I also think in terms of Korean studies, the Iron Age is the perfect place to reconsider the cultural coherency of the peninsula. We're talking about Korean history, we're talking about the peninsula, but there's no Korea here. We're dealing with a multi-ethnic population. We're dealing with a very culturally diverse population, which had a lot of interesting interactions within the peninsula and in neighboring regions too. So recently, I've taken these questions and I've started looking at them from a regional landscape perspective. I originally started looking at the mortuary archaeology of southeastern Korea, and looking at the role of ritual and religion in the formation of Silla and Kaya. But while doing that, I also started looking more at southwestern Korea. And in this region, we have an enigmatic culture known as Mahan. And so, Mahan, for those of you who aren't familiar with this period, it's a cultural designation for a number of polities or statelets on the Korean Peninsula that first appear in Chinese historical texts of the 3rd century. And Mahan, in particular, is described as a collection of small states south of the Daifang Commandery, the Han Chinese Commandery. And it was one of the 3Han or Samhan groups that inhabited the southern peninsula at this time. And so today, the archaeology of Western South Korea is assumed to be the territorial range of Mahan. And so you can see here, I've got a couple maps, one with sort of the approximate location of Mahan in historical texts, and then some mortuary sites excavated in the last 20, 25 years that are all designated in one way or another as Mahan mortuary sites. I think it's fair to say that among the Samhan, even among other groups in early East Asia at this time, Mahan is one of the most poorly understood and enigmatic entities in Korean history. And for that reason, Mahan archaeology uh, is usually asked to answer several very specific questions. So the major topics in Mahan archaeology are, first and foremost, how can we recognize Mahan in the archaeological record? What are the unique material indicators that suggest to us that we're dealing with a unique and coherent culture? And then archaeology is often used to explore where Mahan culture came from. What are the origins of not just Mahan, but complex society, the earliest states or proto-states in Korea? How can we use archaeology to look at cultural aspects that may have come from, Manchuria, northern China, southern China, Japan? How can archaeology help us determine the origins of Mahan culture? And then I'd say the third primary question in Mahan archaeology is, what is the relationship between Mahan and Paekche? Can we use the archaeological record to pinpoint when or if Paekche emerged from Mahan and when Paekche began expanding southwards and conquering Mahan groups as it went? And so you can sort of gather from these three major research topics that Mahan archaeology is very textually oriented. So we start with the historical text first. We say there's something called Mahan. How can we use the archaeology to better explain this concept or add nuance or add, how can we complicate our understanding of Mahan? But I think this sort of shortchanges the archaeology itself. I don't think we necessarily need to start with the assumption of Mahan. And what I think is really interesting about the archaeology of this region is that if we sort of temporarily move Mahan out of the equation, it really forces us to question some very basic archaeological assumptions about what constitutes an archaeological culture, particularly when it comes to tombs and mortuary practices. I would say that Mahan has by far the most diverse and difficult to understand mortuary archaeology of any group on the Korean Peninsula at this time. So in terms of what my questions for Mahan archaeology are, is I sort of want to shift our perspective away from, how can we recognize Mahan with archaeology and ask, well, where does even the idea of Mahan come from in history and in archaeology? And then how did material culture, how did archaeology, how did tombs and mortuary remains contribute to the construction of a Mahan identity? So just shifting our focus a little bit. And so with that in mind, I'm sort of going to sort of pick apart this idea of Mahan for a bit and then move into discussing some interesting aspects of the mortuary record that I think are worth bringing up. So one of the reasons I think Mahan has been so difficult to study is that when we say Mahan today, we're actually conflating at least three completely different phenomena. We've got Mahan as a culturally and politically distinct entity in historical texts. We've got Mahan as a historiographical entity, as a dynastic ancestor for later Korean kingdoms. And more recently, we have Mahan as an archaeological culture located in southwestern Korea. And we really do have to disentangle each use of Mahan in order to get anywhere studying Mahan archaeology. And so to sort of briefly sort of go over these, I think Mahan is a historical entity, is, the first and earliest use of Mahan, and it really is the basis for everything else, but it's really the Mahan we know the least about. It only appears in the account of the Han in the Sangwojur, and again in a modified form in the later history of the later Han. There are scattered mentions of Mahan or Mahan groups as late as the 5th century, recording diplomatic engagement between specific Mahan groups and kingdoms in southern China. But beyond that, it's really quite difficult to make any concrete inferences about what exactly Mahan was based on the very short account of the Han we have to work with. In general, I think all we can say for sure is that Mahan refers to, in a general sense, to a people with a shared culture that were loosely organized into small, relatively independent polities, and that these in turn were made up of hierarchies of towns and ruling townships. And I'm sort of reluctant to say much more based on the history alone. So I'd say after the 5th century, we lose track of Mahan as a historical entity, and Mahan enters the realm of historiography. And in the histories and the treatises of the Koryo and Joseon period, Mahan is most often portrayed as a predecessor or an early stand-in for Paekche, but at various times also inserted as an ancestor of Koguryo. It's often claimed as an ancestor and a link in sort of the chain of succession that connected Koryo or Joseon to semi-mythical ancient kingdoms like Tangun Joseon or Kija Joseon. And what is actually sort of more interesting and perhaps even beyond the confines of historiography is that Mahan, as part of the Samhan, comes to take on, even as far back as the Koryo period, the role as sort of a signifier of a peninsular culture or a peninsular peoples that is, separate from any particular dynasty. And I'm leaning very heavily on the work of Remco Brucker here for that analysis, but I really think it's an important aspect of Mahan and the Samhan. So the most recent usage of Mahan, with the advent of modern scientific excavation and archaeology in Korea, Mahan has again sort of emerged in an entirely different form. Now we have Mahan as an archaeological culture located in southwestern Korea. And initially the tombs excavated in southwestern Korea were equated to Paekche. But I'd say by the 1980s, these tombs had started to become associated with Mahan. And since the 1990s, since the 90s until I would say today, we've seen some really sophisticated attempts to a conceptual distinction between these tombs in Western Korea associated with Mahan, and then the tombs in Eastern Korea associated with Chinhan and Pyeonhan, and eventually Silla and Kaya. So what combination of unique tomb attributes in Western Korea can we label as distinctively Mahan, and how are they different from not only the eastern part of the peninsula, but East Asia as a whole? And this really has remained a major preoccupation with Mahan archaeology. And I think that because of that, I think it's fair to say that certain aspects of Mahan archaeology have been perhaps overemphasized, and also possibly as a result of this historiographical baggage the term has accrued. So I think first, Mahan archaeology, because of its historiographical orientation, has led to the a priori designation of Western Korea or Southwestern Korea as Mahan territory. There's no real room to explain these tombs or any sort of diversity in terms of anything other than Mahan. And second, and this is just my general impression from reading the secondary literature related especially to Mahan tombs, to Mahan mortuary culture, but I do think there's a persistent association between Mahan and the idea of a unique and indigenous material culture tradition, and also narratives of resistance and persistence, not unlike North Korea might employ for Koguryo in the face of conquest, especially as regards to conquest by Paekche, which at this point in the Hansung period would have been much more, in terms of its mortuary culture, oriented towards southern China. They'd adopted the Han Chinese horizontal chamber, stone chamber tomb by that point. So Paekche, Mahan seems to take on these connotations of a unique peninsular culture that persisted in the face of absorption by others. I think the sort of problem of this is that the archaeology of this region, particularly mortuary archaeology, is extremely diverse. And it shows many, many, many different influences from not only elsewhere in the peninsula, but also China and Japan. And so at this point, I want to move away from historiography, away from historical Mahan, and really start to dig into an analysis of the tombs themselves. So to begin with the early Iron Age, Mahan tomb diversity actually appears fairly suddenly in the 2nd century AD. And prior to this, in the early Iron Age and early Proto-Three Kingdoms period, we have a fairly uniform and long-lasting pit tomb or coffin tomb tradition. And these are deeply buried burial pits that contain a single wooden coffin with burial goods arranged around the coffin or inside the coffin. And these usually contain distinctive attached rim ceramics. You can see some examples there on the right of the slide. These fairly simple pots with an attached clay band at the top, a very distinctive early Iron Age phenomenon that we see all over the Southern Peninsula. And in addition to pottery, a real diverse array of bronze objects, slim bronze daggers, axes, chisels, spearheads, and then an array of enigmatic rattles, clappers, and bells, sometimes associated with shamanic ritual or religious practices. But we can maybe discuss that in the Q&A. And then eventually also early iron objects, usually in the form of agricultural tools. So this is the kind of thing we see basically all over the Southern Peninsula. There's nothing particularly unique or Mahan about this in the early Iron Age. But things get weird in the 1st and 2nd century. And my colleague, the distinguished historian of early Korea, Dennis Lee, characterizes Mahan tombs in this period as whack. And I think he's absolutely right to say this. Tombs get quite strange. In the 1st century AD, pit tombs give way to a number of different burial practices with quite distinctive elements. Large tomb mounds built over the top of these interments, surrounding ditches around these mounds, a new array of burial objects that include globular jars that are very reminiscent of the kinds of stuff we see in Han Lilong commandery burials, distinctively shaped two-handled jars, iron in the form of swords with a ring pommel decoration, spears, arrows, axes, sickles, and iron ingots. And many of these practices seem derived from Han China, but certain features also seem linked to southern China, particularly subsurface pits related to the coffin. They seem to have some connection to southern China. The mounds that develop seem to have other connections to Yayoi, Japan. Yeah, there's all kinds of interesting cultural elements circulating from all over East Asia that seem to all coalesce and mingle in early Mahan tombs by the 2nd century. So in the 3rd century, things get a little more diverse. Here we have the beginning of the practice of burying multiple individuals in single burial mounds. And this also has very pronounced sub-regional and very site-specific variations. We find all sorts of interesting configurations of multiple graves in a single mound. And then also in the far southwest, in the Yongsan River region, we find these very distinctive Barrow Tombs, which contain multiple burials in one single mound surrounded by a moat. And the burials themselves are made up of these enormous horizontally placed jars, and also often just simple pits, wood chambers, and wood timbers as well. But the jar burials in these enormous mounds are very distinctive of Yongsan in this period, and they last all the way through to the 5th century. So if I had to sort of summarize this developmental process, I'd say we have a relatively sudden fluorescence of diverse practices that last for about 300 years, beginning in the 1st century and lasting through the mid-4th century, and then persisting even further than that in some regions. There are many sub-regional trends that are quite distinct, and we also have the commingling of practices within single areas and even within individual cemeteries. Other than the diversity itself, there are really no clear material indicators or tomb attributes that we might definitively label as a coherent material, Mahan material culture. And so here's just sort of a summary of the various configurations these tomb elements can appear in tombs associated with Mahan. And so because of this diversity, I think initially we first have to question the utility of the label Mahan in the first place. If this diversity makes it almost impossible to identify anything coherent, why do we even call these tombs Mahan? But beyond this, I think the unexamined application of the term Mahan to the archaeology also ignores the different historical and historiographical connotations of the term that are have been circulating around ancient historical research in Korea. And so I think that archaeological interpretations that invest Mahan with more indigeneity or authenticity than other peninsular groups may be more a reflection of Mahan's historiographical positionality than anything intrinsic to the archaeology. But I also think this diversity is a real opportunity. I think Mahan is a great case study for employing and thinking through some recent trends or threads in archaeological theory regarding identity and materiality. And I think particularly the idea of identity as the dialectic relationship among people, their objects, and their landscapes. So thinking of identity construction as a co-construction and not thinking of archaeology as a mere reflection of identity. So it's something that actively participates in this process. And so with that said, I also don't really want to completely throw out the Mahan concept. I think that would be losing a lot of value. But I want to focus less on what Mahan was or where it comes from, more towards how over time an idea of Mahan was constructed and what the tombs themselves contributed to this. So, I would here like to make a few observations on certain aspects of Mahan tombs that I think can begin to shed light on this, and and some of the interesting social changes that occurred in the region prior to the Three Kingdoms period. And as I said before, this is fairly preliminary, so I would like to hear everyone's opinion, and I apologize if it's not fully coherent yet. Much like Mahan tombs, my thesis is not fully coherent. So the first aspect I would like to emphasize, or at least to explore, is the idea of Barrow tombs and Mounded tombs. So by the 2nd century, when we see all this diversity and all these new practices come in, by the end of the 2nd century, at least 2 different tomb construction methodologies had emerged: Barrow tombs and Mounded tombs. And if we sort of look broadly, we can see that the red dots are all sites for Barrow tombs, and so they sort of coalesce along the western coastline, and especially in the southwest in Yongsan. The blue dots are sites with Mounded tombs. They're much more inland and a bit farther to the north, but still south of the Han River Valley. And then the green dots are sites that have both barrows and mounds together. So a real sort of difficult to interpret distribution of types here. If we're looking for a coherent Mahan, or picking one of these tomb types to designate as Mahan, we've got our work cut out for each other, work cut out for us. Let's see. Yeah, so to go back to the distinctions between these tombs in terms of construction, both Barrow tombs and Mounded tombs produce similar mounded tombs on the landscape. A mound with a ditch, sometimes containing multiple burials. But if we look within the tombs themselves, they appear to represent completely different burial paradigms. So mounded tombs are subsurface burials with a separate mound constructed over them. So if I can draw your attention to the bottom right hand of the slide in that cross section, you can see that in a mounded tomb, first you dig a burial pit underground, and then you construct a mound on top of it. So they're separate entities. But in a Barrow tomb, the mound is constructed first, and then a burial pit is dug into it. And so the mound and the burial chamber are above ground, essentially. So mounded tombs seem to have a direct connection to practices introduced into the region by Han China's administrative commanderies in northern Korea in the 1st century BC. And so the appearance of mounded tombs suggests the adoption of certain aspects of Central Plains style mortuary practices, particularly ritual feasting and offering practices, I would say. And we see a lot of mounded tombs, particularly in areas outside of Mahan territory in Eastern Korea, in areas associated with Chinhan and Pyeonhan. That's basically the standard tomb. But barrows, by contrast, are a distinctive tomb type that are, I would say, wholly disconnected from the Han Chinese paradigm. It's not clear where they come from or how they develop. They possibly have some connection to um, groups up in Manchuria and the Liaoning area that sort of come down in the early Iron Age, perhaps. But the tombs themselves don't seem to develop, or at least they don't become Barrow tombs until the 2nd century. And so in Barrow tombs, the corpse is interred after the construction of the mound in the funeral process. And I think this mode of burial facilitates multiple burial practices, as new burials can be added to the mound, and the mound itself can be extended over time to accommodate more individuals. This is not so easy or even possible, excuse me, in mounded tombs, where you would have to basically destroy the mound, dig another burial pit, and then cover the mound, cover those burials again with a mound. So I think, and I've explored this in the context of Chinhan and Pyeonhan, I think the mounded tomb methodology lends itself to a ritual practice that is outward looking and encourages competitive emulation and interaction competition in the arena of the funeral. Whereas I think the Barrow tomb forces a burying group much more to a specific place and to sort of inward looking ritual treatments that reinforce group solidarity rather than regional communication or interaction. So a related practice to the construction of Barrow tombs is, the creation of multiple burial practices. And I apologize if this slide is a little confusing, but I'm just trying to highlight some of the diverse ways in which multiple individuals could be buried in a single tomb. So the practice of burying multiple individuals in a single tomb begins in earnest in the 3rd century. And by the 4th century, it seems to become a more purposeful ritual practice. And it was retained well into the 5th century in certain areas, even in regions that were supposedly incorporated by Paekche. So these mortuary traditions are continuing, even though politically Mahan may have ceased to exist at this point. So the way multiple burial practices evolve seems to be that we begin initially with discrete burials that over time come to be burials placed next to each other that share a ditch. And then we have multiple burials within a single mound, and then much larger scale stratified barrows made of many burials in various different shapes. We see this particularly in the Yongsan region, where we have jar burial barrow tombs, which produce very large tombs containing many burials in distinctive clusters. And especially in the Panam region in the 4th and 5th century. And on the one hand, I think these practices reinforce the idea that Mahan tombs lacked a cultural coherency. So we see all kinds of different ways in which a tomb could incorporate multiple individuals. And there's really no, other than in Yongsan, there's no regional coherency. It's sort of like each site has its own way of revisiting. Each burying group in each region has their own way of revisiting a tomb and adding more individuals over time over the generations. So rather than a cultural practice common to a historical Mahan culture, the practice of burying multiple individuals in a single tomb reaffirms the lack of a regional consensus in mortuary tradition. But I would say that multiple burials cause the tomb itself over time to become a focal or rallying point for identity and affiliation. So these Barrow tombs are not simply static features of the landscape. They're dynamic and constantly developing features that were revisited time and time again. And so the structure of the Barrow itself is guiding human groups that produced it to return again and again, and it's encouraging a strong association with a particular place, reinforcing intergroup solidarity, and rather than the funeral ritual acting as a means of communication and interaction outside of an individual group. And I think that's why we have so many idiosyncratic, diverse, uh, uh, multiple burial traditions in the region. So the last aspect I really want to draw attention to of these tombs is surrounding ditches. So unlike the distinction between mounds and barrows, unlike multiple burial practices, which are largely restricted to Barrow tombs, surrounding ditches are a common feature of all tombs in the region. And we find them all the way from the Han River Valley in Seoul all the way to the far south in Yongsan. And so if we're looking for a diagnostic feature of Mahan tombs, this might be it. But again, ditches themselves are quite diverse in their shape and form, and they're not necessarily signaling anything cultural. It's they probably originated as a feature of early mounded tombs rather than barrows, and they were possibly the unintended result of scooping nearby earth out to construct a large mound. But by the 4th century, at least, they were a purposeful aspect of mound and burial construction, mound and barrow construction. And so while these objects do seem to have had the practical utility of preventing tomb mound erosion, and their various shapes were probably the result of different logistical concerns resulting from the placement, topology, the microenvironmental context of each individual site and tomb, I do think that the fact that they were probably originating from early mounded tombs and then they were subsequently adopted widely in Barrow tombs does suggest that they were a shared feature that persisted, or that they were either a feature that was adopted regardless of whether you produced mounds or barrows, or they were a shared feature that persisted as tomb construction methods continued to diverge in coastal regions and more inland regions. And so I think despite their diversity and their practical function, they do still point, if not to any kind of cultural unity, certainly the idea of shared practices and communication within the ritual space of the funeral. I think the appearance and spread of ditches represents a selective adoption and sharing of a certain tomb attribute by different burying groups. So if we sort of take these disparate aspects of tombs and look at them collectively, I think we can begin to start constructing a model of how the idea of Mahan comes into existence. I wouldn't say there is a material cultural correlate for Mahan. There's certainly nothing that we can link to a discrete historical entity from Chinese sources from the 3rd century. And the fact that we're trying to look for it is just creating tension among these different Mahan concepts we have. Mahan is a historical entity, Mahan is a historiographical dynastic ancestor, and then Mahan as a material culture in Korea's southwest. So at least in terms of the mortuary record, attempts to find an archaeological expression of a unique culture would be difficult even if there were actually clear and consistent patterns among the many tomb forms in the region. But I do think that the mortuary archaeology of Western Korea does point to a unique trajectory of social political development among peninsular groups, and that the diverse array of barrow and mounded tomb types does constitute an interesting archaeological phenomenon in its own right. So what we have instead of an archaeological indicator of Mahan is a process of becoming Mahan, a process by which a multi-ethnic population with a variety of different cultural influences formed a coherent culture out of this diversity over time. And so to that end, I sort of want to offer a new composite definition of Mahan that incorporates the different connotations of the term. We should call Mahan, what we should call Mahan is the intersection of material cultural similarities built up and reinforced over several generations, and the imposition of a cultural coherence by outside observers that later took root in Korean historiography. And so just like early Chinese and later dynastic historians, I think contemporary researchers, contemporary archaeologists, we are just as complicit in the construction of Mahan through our desire to find a cultural coherence within the noise of various distinct but intermingling material culture traditions. And so by way of conclusion, I'll just say that mortuary material is, of course, only one small aspect of the archaeological assemblage of Western Korea. And this tomb diversity needs to be compared with other aspects of the archaeology, like habitation, village sites, ceramic traditions, the spread of iron metallurgy, craft production, sericulture, all that kind of stuff. And there are actually a number of really interesting dynamic scholars working on those very topics. And I myself am sort of continuing to look at these tombs. I'm in the process of creating some maps and doing some statistical analyses of especially these tombs that have multiple burials. I'm interested in looking at these tombs that in some cases have 30, 40, or 50 burials in one mound, looking very granularly at how they were constructed and what this can tell us about social change over time and the coherency of Mahan. But yeah, I will just leave it there for now and leave you with the idea that Mahan is not a coherent set of material correlates. It is not a thing we can isolate archaeologically and study, but Mahan is a process of becoming. And it's a process that begins in the Iron Age and I think is still in progress today. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dr. Davey. That was absolutely fascinating. I would love to open up the floor to some questions if anybody has some. If you navigate down to the participants button, you should find the raise hand function, which is quite helpful. Otherwise, please feel free to.
Can I just say that I had the rather unnerving experience of turning off my screen share and realizing half of my dissertation committee was in the audience. So.
That's wonderful. Well, I hope they have some questions. That's great. So yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the raise hand function, private message me, or simply say so. Nice. We've got 2 to start. We've got Don Baker, followed by Six himself.
Don, you're muted.
I just unmuted. I think I'm unmuted now. My question simply is, where does Paekche fit into this?
That's a very good question. I would say I'm not sure. I actually don't think tomb archaeology, mortuary archaeology, is a particularly good way, a good means of determining where Paekche comes from or how it eventually conquers most of Mahan territory. We do see, I think, I'm thinking particularly of the work of Kim Sung-ok, who's done some really interesting work looking at how certain aspects of, well, I think certainly by the 4th century, perhaps the 5th century, a more distinctive Paekche style of mounded tomb with a piled stone arrangement around the burial does develop in the Han River Valley. And we do see certain aspects of that spreading southwards, but it's not even and it's not consistent. And so north of the Kum River region, it seems like there was in the 5th and 6th century, there was the whole scale change of tombs over to this Paekche style of tomb. But in the south, we have the continuation until the end of the 5th century of Barrow Tombs but with some Paekche artifacts and pottery within them. And then in the far south, we don't really see anything like that happening until much later. So it does suggest that Paekche's conquest of the region, if it was causing a shift in mortuary behavior, was uneven, and possibly different conquered areas were governed and incorporated differently, I would say.
Okay, thanks.
I was going to ask a similar question, so I think we should pass me and move on. I think Ned Schultz had wanted.
Can I raise a question? Quick question. Were the tombs generally facing in one direction? Often later a tomb. No. In Pungsu often has a big role later in Korea. Any evidence of any kind of Pungsu in this?
Possibly. There's tombs are generally located on low hills, foothills, or flatland, but nothing. No, I would say there's one of the distinctive features of tombs overall is that they're not consistently oriented east-west or north-south or anything like that. It's more they'll follow the natural contours of a hill in some cases, or they seem to have their own idiosyncratic internal methodology that we don't quite understand. And yeah, if anything, I'd say tombs and their arrangement, they're more a result of varied geographical conditions rather than anything Pungsu related, anything geomatically related.
Great. Well, we've got two questions that came in at the same time, one via the chat, and then Mark Bankton has a question. So there's a question from Minley saying, what is the state of North American scholarship on Korean archaeology after your graduation from UCLA?
I choose to be optimistic about it. I think, in fact, maybe I'll do a little plug here. I don't have it handy, but yeah, a group of us put out a special issue of Asian Perspectives in 2019, and I think that is sort of designed as sort of a mission statement to say that, hey, there's still quite a lot of interesting research into Korean archaeology happening in North America. We all just happen to be scattered around, and none of us have tenure-track jobs. But I think I'm choosing to be optimistic about the state of Korean archaeology generally in the U.S.
Great, thank you. Mark, did you want to go ahead?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Jack. I'm not trying to get you into any trouble here with anybody, so I'll be just take this as you like. It seems to me that archaeology in this region would be better served by simply throwing out the whole idea of Mahan in all of its iterations and just looking at the archaeology, trying to figure out what social processes are leading to what we are looking at, especially in mortuary analysis. And I was just wondering what your perspective is on how the current concepts of Mahan, in whichever form they may be misleading archaeologists and those who use archaeology in South Korea and take them in less productive directions. And of course, this is an opinion, but I was just kind of curious on your views regarding that.
Yeah, you really are trying to get me in trouble, I think, Mark. I think there's been a lot of really amazing research in Mahan archaeology, and it's all been done within this paradigm of Mahan exists, therefore we should interpret this archaeology as Mahan in some way. I think there's some really interesting, like this distinction between a barrow and a mounded tomb. That was sort of born out of this idea that things in Western Korea should be different from the East because they are Mahan, they are not Chinhan and Pyeonhan. And I think maybe that perspective allowed researchers like Lee Song-ju or Im Yong-jin to recognize and run with that concept. So I think in many ways, forcing ourselves into the perspective that Mahan existed has led to some very interesting and sophisticated studies. But yeah, I tend to agree with you that perhaps, well, at the very least, we should start with the archaeology first, and then interpret that, and then bring our concept of Mahan from history over, and then compare it that way, rather than starting from the idea of Mahan and interpreting the archaeology as if it were Mahan. I hope that's diplomatic enough.
Brilliant. Next, we have a question from Martin Gilman.
Yeah, actually, I'm Vladimir Glom. We are doubled together. I've got a very simple question: whether we have any tombs on islands, or like, because I couldn't see it on the maps, and if there are any, and it can say something about the island populations, or simply these are not yet excavated because most of the excavations are on construction sites on the mainland. Yeah.
That's a really interesting question, actually. In terms of like definite island archaeology, there's stuff on Jeju. But I would say the one thing about Korea's western coast is that it has changed dramatically since the Iron Age. And so what, in some cases, what is an island today or what is part of the mainland today was not so back then. And I think generally in at least the Mahan period, the water levels of the Yongsan Basin and other basins like the Kum River or the Mangong basins was higher. The water level was higher, and so sites are generally located on higher land than they would have to be today. And so I'm trying to just think off the top of my head. There's no specific island sites that have anything dramatically unique or different on the western coast off the western coast of Korea. But yeah, Jeju is an interesting phenomenon that does have certain aspects in common with Mahan tombs, but not quite. But I think there's arguably more fruitful material to look at if you move a bit farther eastwards and you look at the islands between Japan and Korea. So if you look at Tsushima or what's the other one? Iki Island. But yeah, that's actually a really interesting question, and I'll have to ponder that a bit, I think.
Great, thank you very much. Next, we have a question from my dear ex-colleague from Yonsei GSIS, Luis Botea.
Hello, thank you first of all for organizing the conference. Being in the periphery of Korean studies is really nice to take part in such an event. I have plenty of questions. I found the presentation extremely informative and interesting. For what I understood, maybe I'm a little bit foggy, but it reminds me a little bit to Gina Barnes' idea of elite emergence in the inner Japanese Sea, in the sense how elites start emerging and copying each other into the development of these tombs. So I was wondering, to sum up everything in just one question, I was wondering if if you found any direction in this model. Have you been able to identify any sort of center, any cross pattern of models configuring a little bit of this boreal model emergence?
In the context of Gina Barnes's work, are you talking like about peer polity interaction and like Hyung-Ye Pei's interaction sphere ideas? I think really those still form the basis, and they're the best model for, as a starting framework for understanding the emergence of complex society or social development in this period. I do think it comes down to, interaction between polities and the interaction of these polities with Han China and its commanderies. And then when these sort of disappear a bit, the interaction between the polities themselves become much more important. I think that, Gina Barnes's work and Hyung-Ye Pei's work in this area are still like very valid and probably the best way to go about it. I think what the way I would add to their work is that now we have such an archaeological data set that we can begin to look at the really granular mechanisms of how this interaction took place. And I think interaction via the means of ritual, via mortuary ritual, is the way we can further interrogate and refine these models that of peer polity interaction. So yeah, I wouldn't say that I have anything that either corroborates or refutes anything they've said, but it's more that now we can look more in a more detailed and granular way at these interactions that were the core of how social complexity developed in the region.
Well, thank you very much, Luis. Well, next, Bradley Tatar had a question. He also appears to have linked it in chat. Bradley, I don't know if you want to ask that yourself. Very happy to read it as well.
Yeah, so it's just what it says in the chat. So I was wondering if the two main types of tomb that you've shown, the Barrow tomb and Mound tomb, might be indicative of some kind of cultural diversity, like the contrasting ideologies of Buddhism and Christianity sort of coexist in the modern Korea.
Yeah, I think that's entirely possible. I wouldn't necessarily say they're as divergent as Christianity and Buddhism per se, but yeah, I think it's a really important distinction that has very significant ritual implications. I'm reluctant to say we're dealing with a wholly different cosmology or a religious system or set of practices, but yeah, I do think this fundamental difference that and I guess I should make clear that this is not something I came up with. This is I'm drawing on work like Lee Sung-ju, Im Yong-jin, Kim Sung-ok. All these guys have sort of done the groundwork for me. I'm sort of interpreting what are the implications of these differences. But yeah, I think it could very well be a completely different cosmological religious system. But what is interesting is even if that's the case, then they still coexist at individual sites too. So we do have sites with Barrow Tombs and Mounded Tombs. So if indeed we're dealing with things at the level of different religions, then it's interesting that even in the Iron Age, these religious traditions seem to coexist in a single community that used a single burial ground. So yeah.
Thank you.
Brilliant. I received a question via DM from Jeong Ha. If diverse cultural groups coexisted in Mahan sphere, did they coexist peacefully, or was there any evidence that conflicts between those groups escalated?
I don't know. The one interesting thing about tombs, especially in the late first and then into the second century, is we see a lot more weaponry in tombs, a lot more iron spears, a lot more swords, so a lot more symbols and the accoutrements of warriors, of warfare, or at least the ability to control and make use of weaponry and armies. But I think it's really tricky with the archaeological evidence we have, even outside of tombs, to say anything concretely that there was significant conflict or warfare going on. I think there's more evidence for warfare if we look a bit farther north and we look at the distinction between Hansong Paekche tombs and some of the Hansong Paekche habitation sites, and then some of the habitation sites and villages in the surrounding areas, sometimes associated with the Ye culture. And we do see more evidence of villages with dwellings that have been suddenly burned or set on fire, and they look like these were intentionally burned. And then we find things like burnt cereals and grains, and so it doesn't look like this was an intentional burning of a building, but perhaps a raid of a village or the destruction of a village purposefully in an act of violence or warfare. So there's sort of like various scattered archaeological indicators some kind of intensification of warfare or violence, but I don't think the tombs themselves can say much more beyond that.
Great. Well, I don't see any more hands up or private messages. If anybody has any final questions. Oh, goodness me, all of a sudden. Okay. First of all, we got a question from Han Song-yeol, one of our previous speakers.
Thank you for this fascinating talk. The question that I want to ask is something unrelated to the overall topic or your research direction, but I'm just wondering if there is anything interesting that you found on the kind of gender relations that can be seen from these archaeological evidences, especially from mortuary culture. So, for example, like in terms of the bodies that are excavated from those tombs, are they mostly male or females? And in addition to that, maybe this question is particularly just limited to these types of mounds that had multiple burials. So in that case, what is the kind of connection? It's the kind of, is that a patrilineal kind of connection, kinship, or it's a matrilineal kinship? Thank you.
Excellent question. I would say that the major limitation we have in Iron Age archaeology, especially mortuary archaeology, is we very rarely get skeletal remains. So we often simply don't know. We can't really do much demographic work to, especially with regards to gender. But I will say that, basically, I think Sarah Nelson, great archaeologist who unfortunately, sadly passed away earlier, very recently, she laid down this gauntlet of the idea of gender in Korean archaeology, especially in regards to tombs, that nobody has picked up in the subsequent 30, 40 years since she wrote that stuff. I'm actually very inspired by the work of one of my colleagues, Rachel Lee, who's done some really interesting stuff looking at gender in the earlier period in the Bronze Age in relation to the use of space within habitations or dwellings. But in terms of tombs, we need to create a completely new set of questions and methodologies that we can use to even look for or understand or see gender in the archaeology. I don't think anyone in Korean archaeology has really tried to do that, myself included. Yeah, I'm sort of thinking through ways to do that, but yeah, but I agree with you that especially in the context of barrows with multiple burials, that there's got to be some really interesting stuff going on with gender, and I think if we compare them to their sort of close chronological analogs in Japan, like in the Kyushu burials, like at Yoshinogari, where we do seem to have interesting arrangements of like a central female burial surrounded by male burials. Yeah, there's definitely some interesting stuff going on, but I don't know what it is yet, and I don't think anyone is asking those questions, which is unfortunate.
Oh, thank you very much for that question. And then finally, Six, I believe you had a question yourself.
Yeah. Well, I guess the question I have is, I mean, it's related to the gender question, I think, because it's maybe one of the ways where this question can get answered. But we're looking at burials, but what's conspicuously absent for me is any indication of human remains and how they're used in the archaeological sort of methodology. I mean, I'm just wondering why that is or how that fits in.
Yeah, perhaps I should have added a bit of that to my presentation. But in general, in Korean archaeology, we deal with a real lack of human remains, and I think that's partially as a result of environmental, climatic conditions on the peninsula, especially in the southeast, where we have a very acidic soil and sort of shallow topsoil, which means we don't really usually get any organic remains at all. So we're often dealing with a situation where we just have the faintest outline of a tomb with grave goods, and we can't say anything beyond that. But there are a few sites that have had skeletal remains for the period just prior to the Iron Age or in the early Iron Age. There's Nukdo, which is in the southeast, just off the coast of Gimhae. There's in the early Three Kingdoms period, there's Yeani, which is also in Gimhae, and then there's Imdang, which is in Daegu or in Gyeongsan near Daegu. And then these show, some really interesting social configurations where we actually have enough skeletal material to start reconstructing the age and sex of the dead. We can start saying interesting things, but we really just don't have the material. And I don't think that's anything to do with the way things are excavated in Korea, at least these days. It's just we just don't have them, and so that eliminates the easy way to explore gender. And now we actually have to develop some more interesting indirect ways of looking at this that nobody has taken the time to do.
Great. So again, we've sort of reached a point. If anyone has any sort of final questions, I might sort of thank Dr. Davey for giving this talk today, and to all of you for joining us again. We've had a few weeks off, but we do have already lined up for next week another talk that I believe has been advertised already, but if not, will be advertised soon. Dr. Jin Young-seo is going to give a talk on Cheonado and the reception of Renaissance geography in late Joseon Korea. And that's going to be next week, June 28th at 5 o'clock Pacific. So Luis and other friends who have joined us from Europe, that might make things a little bit tricky. But as will be the case with this talk, we will be making it available online. We're still sort of getting organized in terms of the best way in which to show recorded videos to people in a sort of approachable manner. But yes, this will sort of conclude the sort of quote unquote formal recorded part, but we welcome you to join us for sort of a catch up and any sort of feedback or thoughts you might have on the session. So thank you very much.